You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. It's a special podcast. It's shorter than our usual one, but we're very grateful to have Vice President Mike Pence on the podcast. Thank you, sir, so much for giving us some of your time today.
Robert Vane, it's my honor to be on Leaders and Legends, and how much I have admired your career, your service to the country, and it's a real privilege to be on your podcast today.
Thank you. You close a loop for me, actually, sir. With your appearance today, I have had every living Indiana governor and lieutenant governor on the podcast.
That is my great honor. And since that's the criteria, I'm glad I made the cut, Robert.
Mike Pence is a former vice president. He's a former governor, former congressman. And here comes the three biggies. Former Catholic, my former boss, and a former Democrat. So, Mr. Vice President, which one of those do you want to discuss? Did I get that order correct?
You got my journey has been many and varied, but I got to tell you, having just reached my 65th year, Robert, to have had the blessing of growing up in our home state of Indiana, raised by two wonderful parents who built everything that mattered, which was a family business and a good name. Raised in the Catholic faith, a faith I still cherish as a foundation in my life. But then I've been on my own journey. I started in politics as a Democrat, but by the time I made my way to college, I started to think very deeply about my values, about the ideals, the principles I'd been raised to believe in. And I joined the Reagan Revolution in the 1980s and never looked back. It would carry me into a couple of failed campaigns for Congress, one of which was even before Ronald Reagan left office in 1988. But 10 years later, I had the great privilege of being elected to the Congress of the United States, came across you along the way, and your storied career was governor of Indiana, had your great help in our efforts there. And then I can never fully express the privilege it was to serve as vice president of the United States, but to be back home full circle myself, back home again in Indiana. It's all been worthwhile. And through all the twists and changes, we just feel like we're a family that's been blessed.
You have been, and you've given as much as you've gotten. That's for sure. For those of us who know you and know how incredibly kind and gracious and genuine you are, it's a real treat to get to know you. I'm going to ask you a few questions, and most of them are going to be about the future. I don't know. You can probably see, you can't see, but hold on. I'm wearing my old school conservative Ronald Reagan shirt.
You sure are.
And I want to ask you about that here in a minute. But the very first thing I want to ask you about is, in the last couple of years, we have lost here in Indiana two remarkable leaders, both of whom were longtime friends of yours, for sure. And P.E. McAllister is one of them. And we recently lost Jim Morris. Talk just a minute, please, about your relationship with them and how PE affected you, personally PE affected you as an intellect because I know what a history buff you are.
As I've told his son Chris and mutual friends over the years, I would scarcely have had my first opportunity in public life without the mentoring and selfless support of P. McAllister. He was, in every sense, a Renaissance man. He built an extraordinary business at McAllister Machinery, but he was, in every respect, equally devoted to improving our capital city, improving the lives of people of the state of Indiana, enriching lives through the arts. And he was a man of deep principle and faith. And early in my career, he encouraged me in ways that few other people did, and stood with me through thick and thin through the years. We miss him dearly, but continue to be inspired by his example. Jim Morissette is another one of a kind who literally just left us a few short weeks ago. Jim was one of those people. Our administration saw him appointed to be the American representative to UNICEF, but during the Bush administration, he actually led the World Food Program. But he served in so many different civic capacities in the state of Indiana. But all along the way, everybody that knew Jim Morris knew that he got up every day with a burden to help people achieve their dreams, help improve the lives of people in the community at every level, from seeing businesses expand to seeing people address food shortages and the issues of hunger. Both of these men were stalwart Republicans, but they also demonstrated the depth of commitment to the underserved community and to improving the lives of people at every level in our state and in our nation. Miss him greatly. I thought one of the two might be a man we'll remember in a couple of weeks, Senator Richard Lugar, who was also a colossal figure in American public life, and served his country in the Navy, would go on to be I think, the young mayor that transformed our capital city from what used to derisively be called India No Place to one of the most dynamic capital cities of any state in the country, a real destination. It all began with the man that would become Senator Richard Lugar, and literally a global figure, but never lost his Hoosier touch, did he, Robert? It was, in each case, each of these men achieved colossal success, but they never lost that humility that I think is synonymous with what it means to be a Hoosier.
I'm doing the PR and the media for the statue unveiling of Richard Lugar, so I will see you there, I believe, or at least hope to.
Oh, you bet.
You are exactly right. And nothing that has happened in Indianapolis since 1967, which is when Richard Lugar was elected mayor, nothing happened in this city without the fingerprints of either P.E. McAllister or James T. Morris. I worked for you in 2014, 2015. And if I had told you, well, and then 2012 as well with the veteran stuff, of course. Mm-hmm. But if I had told you, let's just say March, you're an Irishman. Let's say we're just sitting talking on St. Patrick's Day, 2015. And I said, you know what, Governor Pence, in 18 months, you're going to be the next vice president of the United States, and Donald Trump is going to be your president, you would have said?
I would have said I could see half of that being right.
I thought you were going to say the Lord works in mysterious ways.
No, I'm someone that really admired the way that the man I used to call Donald Trump, before he became President Trump, really connected with people across the state of Indiana. I saw that movement rising. I was a late comer to it. I actually, Robert, you may remember, I endorsed somebody else in that primary in Indiana in 2016, but rapidly endorsed our nominee and was proud to run with him as his running mate. But I'll never forget the day that we got the first call about whether I wanted to be considered as a potential running mate for Donald Trump in 2016. And my daughter, Charlotte, who is a great writer, writes for the Daily Wire. And
that's right, she does.
Superstar. She's out there at the governor's cabin in Brown County. And to be honest with you, I was a little bit taken aback by the approach. I was taking it to prayer. Karen and I were talking. The family was talking, as we do through everything. And Charlotte looked at me at one point, Robert, and said, "We all saw this coming, Dad." I said, I'm glad you did, because it would have been the farthest thing from my mind. I was head down working on reelection for my second term as governor. We would have been reelected. I think we'd really delivered for Hoosiers over 4 years. We'd made our way through even some choppy waters, and we were headed for a reelection. And when this opportunity came along, I was humbled by it. But I remember when Donald Trump invited me to Bedminster for the interview, we were talking, and I told him that the only thing I needed to know was two things. Number one is our family needed to know their family. We needed to know because everything the Pences do, we do as a family, which is actually very similar to the Trumps. I think the President Trump's closest advisors are actually members of his family, and that's equally true for me. But the other part was I said, I'd like to know what the job description is.
Yeah, it's because it's changed quite a bit.
Yeah. And I told him, I said, look, I know as a governor, I can have real impact. We've done some innovative things on tax reform, on expanding educational choice opportunities. We'd even brought consumer-directed health care into the Medicaid system, and we're reforming public health systems in ways that were and helping people at the lowest rung on life's ladder. But I said, I'd like to know what kind of a vice president you want. And Robert, I'll never forget he just answered with one word. He said, active. I said, active. And I said, you want to maybe explain that a little bit? And he goes, active. When he said Congress, so active in the legislative process. You travel around the country being in congressional leadership, and as a governor, I'd like you to be active around the country. And you were on the Foreign Affairs Committee, so I'd like you to be active representing us around the world. And I have to tell you, when I think of those 4 years, and I'm incredibly proud of the record of the Trump-Pence administration, all that we did to rebuild our military, revive our economy, appoint conservatives to our course, I can tell you, when I think of the word active, that is a really good description of every day of my life for 4 years.
Where would you be, and politically perhaps, in terms of your career, but also in terms of your everyday sense of joy? I'm going to steal that word from Chicago for the point of this conversation, this question. Where would you be without Karen Pence?
I honestly think I would have made my way probably in that legal career that I was starting in Indianapolis, and probably would have looked for ways to be involved in the community. But to have married such an extraordinary woman who from the day we met thought more highly of me than I thought of myself, and that hasn't changed in 39 years. And also a woman of profound faith. My wife, Karen, is somebody that really believes that you go where you're called, and the confidence she's had in us to be willing to step forward, to reach for our dreams, to try and fulfill whatever calling we believe in our hearts that God's put on our lives. It's made all the difference for me. And I wouldn't have gotten out the front door of public service without Karen Pence at my side.
As we discussed earlier, this is the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our very special, very distinguished guest is Vice President Mike Pence. As I chuckled earlier, I am wearing my old school conservative T-shirt with a big fat picture of Ronald Reagan on it. You have grown up. You're 8 years older than I am. Sorry to mention that, but we both grew up in the Reagan era, just out of the Nixon times. Right. And you're working so hard. There's a campaign going on for president. You're working so hard on so many other things. Typical Mike Pence, grassroots level, talking to the folks at the diners and at the dinners. Is it your goal, drive, to get us back to the Reaganesque period of the Republican Party? Or do we have to accept in some ways that it's changed and isn't going to go all the way back?
I think for me, I've always believed that the ideas that Ronald Reagan brought to the fore nationally really go to the very heart of the American experiment. The belief in limited government, Robert. The belief in a strong national defense. The belief in traditional values, including the right to life. These are not ideals that originated with Ronald Reagan. One of my favorite Reagan quotes at the beginning of his autobiography was, he said, people have called me the great communicator, but he said, I'm not the great communicator. He said, I just have communicated great things that have come from the heart of a great nation. And I honestly, as a student of the American founding, as a student of American history, I couldn't agree more. To me, it's not a matter of going back to what one particular leader meant to the nation. It's really about recognizing that the Republican Party has to be the party that supports American leadership in the world. And that requires a strong national defense to defend our country and to stand with our treaty allies. The Republican Party has to be the party of fiscal responsibility and reform. Lord knows the other party is prepared to continue to drive us into the ditch of a fiscal crisis, a mountain range of debt, spending, higher taxes. The Republican Party's got to be the alternative, not an echo. And on the sanctity of life, which I know you cherish, and traditional values, I think the Republican Party has to stand with compassion and clarity for those values as well. We need to offer the American people those policies for two reasons. Number one, I think they're a pathway to victory. The foundation we created in Washington, advancingamericanfreedom.com, has been in some days singularly championing those principles as populism seems to have taken its hold in many quarters in the leadership of the Republican Party today. But I honestly believe that by articulating these values, number one, I think we're articulating the values of the vast majority, not only of Republicans, but a clear majority of Americans. And I honestly believe that while there's this populist trend, populism unmoored to conservative principles, is prepared to walk away from our allies on the world stage, ignore the national debt, marginalize the right to life. I don't believe that's where the vast majority of Republicans or Americans are. So number one, I think it's a pathway to victory for us if we articulate those values and lay out a clear conservative choice for the American people. Secondly, and more importantly by a lot, I think these are the principles that make America strong, secure, prosperous, and free, and also make America that beacon of freedom and hope for the world. So, like I say, we don't know what the future holds at our house, but we know who holds the future, and we're just going to continue to articulate those values because we not only think it's a pathway for the Republican Party to achieve success, but more importantly, I think it's a pathway for the American people to realize their greatest potential.
Well, Ronald Reagan received 489 electoral votes in 1980. And
right.
Shockingly, he bettered that in 1984 with 525 electoral votes, I believe. So your point, sir, Mr. Vice President, about it being a winning formula has been proven quite substantially. You've gotten a million questions and done a ton of interviews about January 6th. So to me, that's land that's been trodden pretty hard. There's one thing I would like to ask you about. It's a later date in January. I was very proud of you, if I may say that, for attending the inauguration, for being there on that amazing day in the American democracy where we peacefully cede power, which is what we did on that day. What was January 20th, 2021 like for you, especially when the president wasn't going to be there? You knew so many people, including Dan Quayle. It was great to see him in some of the photos. What did January 20th mean to you?
America is, as having worn the uniform, America is the inspiration of the world. And the peaceful transfer of power in the United States of America is a centerpiece of the way we demonstrate that self-government works to the wider world. And so for me, and I appreciate you, look, I understood the disappointment that people felt from the election in 2020. Remember, I was on the ballot.
Yeah.
I fully supported all of the challenges that were brought into courts and by states around the country. But once states had certified their elections and certified their electoral votes, I knew on January 6th that my duty under the Constitution was clear. And that was simply that as vice president, the Constitution reads that it was my duty to preside over a joint session of Congress where the Electoral College votes shall be opened and shall be counted. No discretion there. No vice president in history had ever thought that they could decide which votes to count and which not. In fact, as I've said many times, Robert, and I'll say to you, as a student of the American founding, it wasn't lost on me from the first time I heard this theory that our founders had literally fought a war to free our nation from a king. So the idea that any one person could ever choose who the leadership of our country would be was a profoundly un-American idea, and one that I believe, by God's grace, that I did my duty on that day in early January of 2021. But I must tell you that going to the inauguration, it was a melancholy day for me. The president and I had actually spoken many times. It's largely forgotten, but he and I had actually parted very amicably at the end of the administration. My impression when the morning after January 6th, President Trump had gone on national television, condemned the rioters, used the phrase, "you will pay." He committed to a peaceful transfer of power. And over the next 3 weeks, we saw to that. In fact, President and I met many times in the days leading up to January 20th. And we actually spoke that evening after I arrived back in Indiana about the experience. But while the president made the decision not to attend, I recall he was supportive of me attending. I simply had told him that it was my intention. I thought it was appropriate for our administration to be represented there. And I remember the president saying quietly that he was fine with that. And I think even in that moment, he understood that the symbolism of that day to the American people and to the world was enormously important. Look, sometimes people ask me what the high point of my career was, and it's hard to find a more humbling day than January 20th, 2017, when I put my left hand on Ronald Reagan's Bible and raised my right hand and took the oath of office to support and defend the Constitution as Vice President of the United States. I would tell you that day, 4 years later, the emotions were opposite, but the duty was the same. And as I said, I'll always believe by God's grace that in those days that we did our duty and we chose to support and defend the Constitution. And I've been deeply humbled over the years that while I have my critics, deeply humbled how many Americans from every walk of life have come up and expressed their appreciation for the stand that we took.
One more question before we, get to the 5 questions we ask everyone. Also want to make sure if you haven't, haven't read Craig Shirley's new book, The Search for Reagan. I know you and Craig are buddies. You should definitely read it. I read the book and then interviewed him for the podcast. It's coming out in a few weeks. You would really enjoy the book. And last question, and I thought of this times I've seen you since 2021, since that January day. Is it weird, like not having people around you all the time? Like the transition from president to former president, it's got to be jarring because of the commander in chief, but you still have a detail and all this sort of thing. Vice president, you're like Harry Truman. You put your stuff in the car and then you drive away. Is it just odd in some ways? Am I on Dallas? Did I wake up from a dream in the shower?
Yeah. Robert, it's in my case, I put my stuff in the truck.
Red.
It's a red truck. Thank you. Thanks for remembering.
Where's Bart Lamont when we need him?
Yeah, there's a line in my book, and I'm going to grab the book you mentioned, but any of your listeners, I'd be honored if they're interested in our work and some of the things we reflected on. They can grab my autobiography, which is entitled "So Help Me God." But in the epitaph of that book, I actually quote something that Calvin Coolidge said. He said, "We draw our presidents from among the people, and it is altogether wholesome that they return to them."
Exactly.
Calvin Coolidge did that. And I wrote in my book that what's true of presidents is also true of vice presidents. I will tell you the time since we've left office, after a few months, in a rental in Virginia, we moved home to Indiana, bought 5 acres and a pond. We go to the Cracker Barrel, we shop at the Kroger, and we've seen the birth of 3 of our granddaughters. Our son, the Marine, he and his wife have given us 2. Our daughter, married to the Navy pilot, has given us 1. And our lives are very rich. And I would tell you, if our lives ever carry us back into elected or appointed public service, I can tell you we will cherish these years of just having been able to return to some semblance of normalcy, which I believe at the end of the day has been a blessing of God in our lives.
If anyone tells you that I've had you on the podcast just because I want to have your fellow Hanover College graduate Woody Harrelson on the podcast, that's not true, sir. This is all about you. Here are the 5 questions, and you've got to be proud. I need to say this very quick since I mentioned Hanover, of Eric Holcomb and the job he's done as governor.
Yeah, I call Governor Holcomb the second most surprised man in Indiana in 2016.
Now that I definitely believe.
He was my lieutenant governor, and I called him one night and said, "Eric, I just got a phone call. I'm going to be running for vice president, and you're going to be running for governor. And to say that I am proud of the job that Governor Holcomb and First Lady Janet Holcomb have done would be a gross understatement. They were literally called into service. He's an old Navy guy, service without much notice, and has served Indiana with integrity. And he will leave the state more prosperous and more successful than when he found it. And I couldn't be more proud.
Here are the 5 questions that everybody has answered, from Secret Service agent Clint Hill to Medal of Honor recipient Sammy Davis to Debbie Knox.
One of my heroes.
So, what was your first job?
First job was I was a dishwasher at Gene's Cafeteria in Eastbrook Plaza in Columbus, Indiana.
I love it. What was your first concert?
My very first concert that I attended, I believe, was Earth, Wind, and Fire, Louisville, Kentucky, as a sophomore at Hanover College. And obviously with Maurice White, I think we can all agree, literally the greatest ensemble performance band in history.
Spectacular. That's a pretty darn good answer. I would not have anticipated that. I wish I had seen them back then. Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
There's a book that Karen and I try and open together every morning with the letters HOLY on the front. And think of that verse that says, "Blessed is a man that does not walk in the counsel of the wicked or stand in the way of sinners, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night." And for me, the wisdom, the encouragement in good times and in challenging times that we've drawn from spending a little time every day in the Bible is something I'd always recommend to anybody.
Bonus question real quick. Do you have a favorite movie that has a biblical theme or foundation?
Wow, that has a biblical theme or a foundation. I would tell you, there's a whole new genre of Christian films that have come out lately that have been very moving to me. The Kendrick brothers, who I've gotten to know just a little bit, have created some incredibly important work. But there was a documentary that they created recently that has to do with the miracle of adoption, and entitled Know the Father, that is available on streaming right now. And there are surprises in that have to have been providential, but they're true stories. And I'm someone that believes you can't be pro-life unless you're pro-adoption. And this is probably one of the strongest faith-based affirmations of adoptions I've ever seen.
What did you think, just very quickly, what did you think when you saw, I'm assuming you've seen it, The Passion of the Christ the first time?
Oh, just I think like anyone, I had limited expectations, but I thought the presentation was and continues to be not only a powerful motion picture, but really an important presentation of the Passion of Jesus Christ, and it's one that I think is going to carry through the decades.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Having been around a little bit of history in my day, I would tell you I continue to be fascinated, and I'll take a half step away from the biblical moments in history that I would have loved to have been standing off in the crowd and watching. The American founding continues to be a very inspiring moment for me, to think of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, to think of the fact that here was a group of men at the time and their families who, when it says at the end of that declaration, they risked their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor. That wasn't poetry, Robert. You know that. You're a student of history. At the time they signed the Declaration of Independence, there was a British armada floating just off of New York Harbor with 40,000 troops that was equal to the population of Philadelphia, the largest city in the colonies at the time. Literally, there was a massive armada, and there was only one standing order from the King of England, and that was that anyone who would sign a declaration asserting independence from England was to be, quote, hanged by the neck until they were dead. And
Right.
so these people literally put their lives on the line so that you and I could live in freedom. And to witness that, to witness what took place in the years of the war, and took place at the drafting of the Constitution, I'd love to slip back in time and watch those days unfold.
That's a very popular answer. The other one you would enjoy is several people. I've done 276 interviews for the podcast. Several people have mentioned Sermon on the Mount. Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose? I've never asked someone of your stature, and I mean that sincerely, this question, governors and senators, but you have had dinner with so many amazing people. But if you could choose someone, pick their brain for 2 hours off the record, whom would you choose living today?
I've had an incredible privilege to meet with world leaders, great champions. Someone I never met, though, is actually in a Hong Kong prison right now. His name is Jimmy Lai. And Jimmy was a incredibly successful business leader who championed the freedom of the people of Hong Kong, who resisted the Chinese tyranny that just literally consumed Hong Kong, breaking a long-standing agreement with the United Kingdom and then subjecting them to the communist tyranny that is the People's Republic of China today. For the reason that he refused to go along with the suppression of free speech, a free and independent press, he now languishes in a prison in Hong Kong. And if he hasn't already been transferred into a Chinese prison, and to me, he is the Natan Sharansky of today. He is a man of extraordinary. Robert, he could have fled. He's a very wealthy man. He could have fled and moved to Paris. He could live anywhere in the world, but he stayed to be with his people, to stand for freedom. And I've received correspondence directly from him. We've continued to champion him. We pray for his release someday, but more than that, we pray that freedom would someday break out for people not only of Hong Kong, but of China.
Very inspiring and unique answer. We've had some great answers for sure. That's right at the top. You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today has been former Vice President Mike Pence. Thank you so much, sir, for your time. I know you got a million things going on. Your staff was wonderful. I'd love to have you on again. Maybe I can get your older brother to join us.
Good luck with my older brother. He's a veteran like you. Those guys could be tough. But Robert Payne, let me thank you. Thanks for keeping the legacy of P.E. McAllister so alive and the way you carry yourself in your life. And thanks for having me on Leaders and Legends. It's been a privilege. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.